You're listening to Grain of Salt, a podcast hosted by Tom Burtless and Christa Glennie Seychew, covering the Buffalo Niagara region's food and drink scene. This week's episode is brought to you by Step Out Buffalo. Check out stepoutbuffalo.com for what to see, things to do, and food to try in Western New York. Find info on festivals, beer events, concerts, tours, and everything else happening in Buffalo. This week on Grain of Salt, Christa talks with sommelier Tony Rials of Bourbon and Butter and the wine director and general manager of Ristorante Lombardo, Tommy Lombardo. Why isn't wine as popular amongst the cool kids as craft beer and cocktails? Why are there so many restaurants allowing distributors to create their wine lists? What can you do if you want to learn more about wine? Today you'll hear two of the local restaurant industry's most educated palates discuss these issues.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Grain of Salt. This is Christa Glennie Seychew, your host for today. Today's episode is brought to you by StepOutBuffalo.com. We are sitting with Tommy Lombardo, or Tom Lombardo Jr., is that correct? Something like that?
Yeah, something like that. Not exactly.
From Ristorante Lombardo, and Tony Rials, and that is the proper pronunciation of your name.
It is, thanks.
From Bourbon and Butter, who are probably two of our most talented restaurant people in general, but when it comes to wine, they certainly stand head and shoulders above the general populace. And so we're here actually to talk about wine and to talk about wine in restaurants and to sort of lay some standard ground to help us continue that conversation in future podcasts. So to start off, I would like, if you guys wouldn't mind, and I know sometimes it is uncomfortable to talk about yourself, but if you wouldn't mind sharing with us a little bit about your background, what you're currently doing in wine, and any sort of very impactful, memorable experience that sort of started you on your path to being so fascinated, interested, and invested in wine. Actually, I'm going to pull a coup here and start with Tony. That's all right. Tony?
All right. I guess I started with wine way back when I was, obviously growing up with my parents, they always had wine in the house. Something that my dad always really cared about. So from a young age, I was sort of exposed to it.
And you grew up in the Midwest, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Once I started college, I was working at a restaurant. I was like a busboy, or I don't know, bread boy maybe even, I don't know. And they were pretty good about doing tastings with us. So naturally, I got to drink illegally, which was pretty cool, and made me happy as a freshman in college. But it was your first big exposure to actually trying, some halfway decent wine, not just box wine, even though I love my dad, but it was pretty much box wine for a lot of the time. And from then, once I moved to New York, to Rochester actually, the exposure grew even more, and I was allowed to sit on like the actual tastings with purveyors, and that really started piquing my interest. Watching the way that the chefs worked in the kitchen, how they were pairing food with wine. You'd have the somm in there working with them side by side, going over the stuff for the night. There were always like constant quizzes, and the wine list was something I had never worked with before. It was like way above my head. So when you actually got to talk to a table and they would ask you a question, you just felt really stupid that you had no idea what you were talking about. At that point, I was like, maybe I should take this a little bit more seriously.
So that inspired you to be able to speak more in a relevant way to
Well, yeah, I mean, your whole job was trying to sell and talk about something. And I had always, if I was going to do it, I was really passionate about it. So I wasn't going to
That's kind of how you roll in general.
Yeah, I would just say
Take
so.
You the Ice program is a good example of that.
Nice. So from there, at some point, I decided that I wanted to become a master sommelier. That was not going to happen. I took my...
Come on, it's not like you haven't even tried.
No, I have these grandiose plans of trying to take the next level, the advanced level, but it's a pretty enormous step.
It is. And when did you complete? What level is it? What is the name of the level that you're on now?
It's just you're a certified sommelier.
Right. And are there two levels after that? Correct.
Yes.
Advanced and master.
through the Court of Master Sommeliers, but there's a couple other ones. Tommy's done some of the coursework as well. Actually, I mean, around Rochester and Buffalo, there's a lot of people that have done the same thing and really have that same accreditation and are doing more. I mean, it's pretty cool to see that explosion and how, a lot of the restaurant nerds are really taking it seriously and kind of getting into it.
And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, but we're going to switch to Tommy real quick and have him share a little bit about his background. And then, Tony, I'll flop back to you and we'll talk about what you're doing right now.
Great, yeah. So, like Tony, I grew up around wine. I grew up in a restaurant, so there was a lot of exposure there. But not really until, the similar experience was I living and working in New York. But even I worked in maybe about 4 or 5 restaurants, and even when I was working at L'Artusi and Dell'Anima, which were really, really wine-centric restaurants with
Very much
really
so.
big wine programs, until my last job in New York was at the wine bar Amphora, where there was just maybe about 5 or 6 employees, and like the restaurant Tony was working at Dell'Anima and L'Artusi, you were always part of wine tastings, and they're always working to expose you to wine, but it never really seemed to really, really grab me until I was at Amphora, because, it's just like it's just like wine is just flowing over you.
Well, it's total immersion, right? The other places are still very food-centric, and there's lots of other things to be distracted with. I mean, I know you were very into cocktails and very into the food programs at the first 2 restaurants, right?
That's definitely accurate. And, it's just kind of like the wine is always open, right? And you have access to taste whatever you want, whenever you want. And you also need to learn about a lot of the wine, and you're constantly, and we would do these producer nights, they call them. Every Thursday was producer night. So they would pick a producer, get all the bottlings they could from that specific producer in, open them all up. And if the producer was in town, they'd be there to present the wines. And, we would taste through all of these wines. And I'd say not until maybe about 4 or 5 months of working there did I really start to just something clicked where I, a lot. People that work in wine will say some people are just kind of born with it, and then others have to kind of practice at it in terms of tasting. Like some people are super tasters,
right?
And then some people just have to practice smelling and tasting and smelling and tasting over and over and over again. And then finally they'll start to pick things up that they weren't before and
be able to identify.
Yeah.
It's about, I think more than just picking flavors up, it's also about being able to notice a flavor and use the catalog in your head to address what that flavor is, because that's a skill that I know even a lot of chefs don't necessarily have if they're blind tasting something, being able to immediately recall what that is.
Like I can,
I
can't think of it.
I mean, that's a special skill set, I think.
So when I was working there, I decided to take a course at IWC, the International Wine Center, which is essentially the equivalent of what Tony has. I have my advanced certificate, which would qualify me to get my diploma, which is a 2-year course at the International Wine Center. International Wine Center is a little bit more geared towards journalists, where the Court of Master Sommeliers is more geared towards restaurant
Somms,
people.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Tony, and can you tell us, so you came when you moved to Buffalo from Rochester, because where we left you off, you were the wine guy and you were learning all about wine in Rochester, and then you went and got your certification. But that happened. Didn't that happen once you were here already, or part of it?
The first time I was in Buffalo.
Okay. See, this gets really confusing. So maybe we can make a synopsis.
I always tend to leave that part of my life out.
All right, let's do that.
Either way, I got certified. It was a cool day. I was up in Toronto. And honestly, that was early spring, I think. And by early fall, I had moved to New York City. And then when I actually came back to Buffalo, for about 3 years ago, I believe it was.
You came with Edward.
Yeah, we came to do the Hotel Lafayette. And that was the first, technically the second time I was given the freedom to design a wine list, from the ground up, but the first time that it was my thing to do. And,
right.
I had complete freedom.
You weren't being influenced and controlled by other people.
Yeah, there wasn't someone pulling some strings.
Right.
And so that was pretty cool to kind of, suddenly get to use all your resources that you had been working on for so long. And the relationships that you kind of grown with your reps and other people that you had met throughout the industry.
And And how many reps? So when we say this for lay people, how many different wine distributors are you currently working with?
Well, if you're smart, not many.
Well, right. A lot of people have 2 or 3, and that can be good in the sense that they are dealing with less salespeople and able to really hone in on someone's catalog. But it also means that the list is limited to what those 1 or 2 distributors carry.
Yeah, Tommy and I. Sorry, not to
It's okay. Go ahead.
We've talked about it before. We've met with other like very small distributors that are bringing in really incredible wine, but it's a little tough just to keep working. Like buying one thing from all these people, it's not worth our time. It's
right.
not
If you have
money.
16 distributors each selling you 2 things, that's way more challenging than 2 distributors selling you 16 things. Right.
Well, it is, but you're also kind of picking the best of a much wider sample. Than,
Sure.
So it's better for the customers. So I think it's more about a resource thing.
Well, because
and that's a bigger issue. It's just like, do you have the resources and the staff to
deal with that many different
buying
distributors
from 16, 20 different people?
Well, I think, Tony, the reason why I brought it up is because I recall you telling me at one point you were dealing with, a bazillion distributors
Yeah, I was.
at the
still
hotel.
have
Okay,
quite a
so tell me, how many distributors do you think you have right now?
15, 16.
See, I was right. Okay. So, and that allows you to have this really broad spectrum of product available really at any time. I mean, I know you change the wine list often.
Yeah. I mean, we're both constantly tasting and searching out new products. Some of the stuff, like you can see where products are coming from. That's not even currently available to us. So we have to kind of search those out and maybe not even get to taste them. And it's just research that you've done and kind of theory based. And then you buy a little bit and you see, it paid off and it works. But yeah,
because some of it's about getting your customer to appreciate the wine and order it, correct? Or for them to, you guys can have the most eclectic, phenomenal lists in the whole world. But if customers don't know how to read them or aren't familiar with them, and the in-house restaurant isn't doing their job to educate and share them with people and tell their story. I mean, Tommy, I think twice now I've been in the restaurant where the wine that I had was exponentially better after you told me the story about it,
Sure.
I think that's a general wine and any experience. We've seen it certainly happen with local food. When you talk about the farm to somebody, they certainly have a different appreciation for it. For the ingredient that's on their plate. So let's return quickly to Tony. If you could summarize for me sort of what your current role is in how you work with wine and how much of your week. I mean, you're also the cocktail guy, and you clearly have a lot of responsibilities with other restaurants that Mike runs.
Sure.
So can you just share a little bit with us about that?
Yeah, I mean, my main focus is always still is on bourbon and butter. That's my little baby. So, I mean, yeah, there's other stuff going on, but that's what I'm focusing on. As far as the wine specific, we've definitely started narrowing it down. It was a pretty large list when we first opened, back when it was Mike A's, and we've started like trimming and getting smaller and smaller, but it's definitely become more focused and streamlined. Finding more interesting producers, styles, grapes. It doesn't even have to be necessarily more interesting, just things that we're enjoying more right now. And that's kind of all I've done on the tastings. We've gotten to a really good place with all of our distributors where, they're not wasting our time and we're not wasting theirs. So they're showing us things that are really special within their programs. So I can source a little bit easier that way. But there's just so much new great wine becoming available to us around here that for us being able to actually get a hold of it now is pretty awesome. And then we get to pass on that enthusiasm and that reward to our guests, which is the whole point of it,
Very exciting. Well, there's certainly a lot of other things I'd like to ask you about that, but we're going to try to stick with the format here so that we get everything covered. So, Tommy, please tell me about your decision to come back here and sort of the way that you've sort of taken over the wine program at the restaurant and what that means for you and for your guests, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, it was really just a matter of getting the wines that I was familiar with on the list. I worked with a lot of different wines in New York, and I knew about them, so I knew them, I was comfortable with them, I knew they were good, so I pretty much started by getting a lot of those wines in and getting them on our wine list. And then the next step would be training the staff and introducing them to the customers. And that was 3 years ago. So obviously there's more wine out there in the world to learn about and be exposed to. And it's a never ending process also learning about the wine and learning about wine in general, which I'm always trying to do. But I'm also the general manager of the restaurant. And Tony's also the cocktail and beverage and bar director for his restaurant. So, you only have a limited amount of time that you can do stuff like that.
Sure.
But in terms of what I'm trying to do, the wine list, expose people to smaller production, more naturally made wine that's made in the vineyard and not in the cellar, for the most part. You'll come into my wine list and you can look at bottles and say, "Oh, gotcha. That's not it. That's not that," for sure. Because I don't want this to be a experience for someone that comes to my restaurant and say, "Well, I like this," and
right,
and I, never in a million years would I ever say, "Oh, well,
that's terrible. You shouldn't be drinking,"
or something
that.
like that. Because at the end of the day, because wine can be such an intimidating thing for people.
It is, and we can.
So
talk about that a little bit.
I always try to mention it's just but you really have to drink what you like. All of this education about, all this education that we're talking about is not for the consumer. It's for the wine professional so that they can communicate with the consumer. So the consumer can talk to me and say, "I like this, this, and this, and this." And then I can kind of translate what they're saying in my mind and say, "Oh, that's the kind of wine they're looking for." Or I could take it one step further and say, well, if they like this, I can push them a little bit.
Right, give them something just a little more wow factor.
Yeah, I can just kind of I can push them just a little bit out of their comfort zone and introduce them to this. And then if they like that, then maybe we can go next time a step further and further. So,
and they come in eager to learn, because who doesn't want to learn something new and have a new exciting experience?
Because it's unforgettable, right?
That's the thing is, not only are you adding to the memory of the meal that they're having there, which hopefully is special in and of itself, but I find that, the key to successful marketing isn't actually marketing. It's about having a product with an authentic story that you can share with people. And that people, we are almost evolutionarily programmed for storytelling and learning through storytelling. It's what was done for thousands and thousands of years. And so it doesn't surprise me that that's really the way that somebody buys into something and feels that they understand it and it's somehow part of their story now too, right?
Right.
And so I think that's what happens when you have staff that really understands a lot about the wines that are being offered, which is not always the case in every restaurant situation.
Mm-hmm.
And so how much time would you say that you dedicate to educating your staff about wine, or is there a specific way in which you do that?
Well, every Saturday we taste a wine. So we have a staff meeting every Saturday. And then in addition to that, I'd say once a month we get the entire staff in there on a weekday afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll taste a thematic series of wines.
Certainly.
But it's definitely challenging to get, which is not a huge issue because I'm there pretty much every single night.
Sure. So
if I'm not there, I usually schedule a server that excels in that knowledge, so that they can kind of pinch hit in terms of the sommelier on the floor. And
Tony, I know you're really at Bourbon and Butter almost every day that it's open, right? So
almost.
So how much time do you dedicate to wine training for the staff there? Or is it something where you really are acting as the somm and that's really your role?
We do both. I mean, to be honest, being stuck behind the bar, as much as I love it back there, I do love playing somm and getting out there and talking to people about it. But when you have a full bar and a full restaurant, that's not
super challenging.
Yeah, it's really difficult to do. So doing big tastings with our staff is a little bit difficult. But I really try to get like one-on-one with them each day. That anytime we have new products come in or if they have questions, I'm always there for them. We taste through stuff pretty frequently, but mostly it's just right before the shift starts, we kind of talk about the new products we have, whatever's relevant about it. And that seems to really help with them. They're all very inquisitive too. I think they all take their their gigs pretty seriously. So they're, really interested to learn as well.
Right.
And to impart that to the staff.
Well, and honestly, the more they know and the more wine they sell, the more money they make.
Yeah,
period.
absolutely.
So it behooves them to do that, right?
And at this point, whether I'm stuck behind the bar or not, it is my job and it's what I enjoy. So yeah, I find a way. I've got another crazy bartender right next to me, all the time. So she can hang by
You mean
herself.
Jill? I don't know if she's crazy. She's crazy good.
Crazy good. That's exactly the way I meant it. But no, I mean, I can, she can hold the bar down for 5 minutes while I run out and talk to a guest. You like that?
Yeah, good.
Sorry, we're drinking wine, everybody. Excuse
Yeah, being able to, to impart our kind of enjoyment with the staff, I think is pretty cool. And then they definitely latch onto it pretty quickly. And
I think that's really fundamental. And I'm going to go a little out of order here of what we wanted to talk about, because a couple terms have come up that I like to define terms so that we're all talking about the same thing. And I try to do that in a way that's pretty standardized so that the listener can also use those terms in whatever business and be understood. So, Tommy, you talked a little bit about small producer wines and natural wines. And I had wanted us to sort of define the difference between a couple different words.
Okay. Small
Producer versus mass producer. And then also the ideas of natural, organic, and biodynamic.
Okay.
And Tony, please feel free to chime in, because Tommy and I will talk all day, given the opportunity. Anyway, so I had actually wanted to create a parallel for people visually between the idea of craft beer versus sort of industrial beer.
Right.
And craft beer has certainly been embraced by the average American in a way that I never thought that it would be. Especially coming from Seattle in the 90s, craft beer, then called microbrews, were huge. Moved to Buffalo and nobody knew what I was talking about. And so, to see that actually have sort of a second emergence and be more widespread in the last 5 to 10 years has been sort of a fascinating thing. But I think that same, and certainly craft cocktails versus cocktails made with all kinds of, processed hyper food colored fake flavoring sort of mixers is passing out of style. So I think the same parallel obviously can be drawn between small producer wine and mass producer wine. But for some reason, that doesn't seem to be a conversation the average person who goes to a bar and has craft beer or has a craft cocktail knows about or is interested in having.
Well, I think the first problem is a lot more nuanced. It's a lot harder to identify a mass-produced wine versus a small.
The labels can be very confusing for people. The varietals and all of the domain.
So I mean, it's easy to look at and say, okay, that's a Budweiser and that's an Allagash, or Budweiser versus Community Beer Works, or even with cocktails when you look at the blue curacao behind the bar.
Although that's supposedly having
I still use that.
The curacao is having some kind of comeback. I just
read about. Good curacao, but there's nothing wrong with the actual concept of good quality made curacao. But
I was just being sarcastic.
So I think it's a little bit harder for people to define what is small production. At the end of the day, like we said, they just drink what they like, and it's nobody's fault. What the problem is that there just doesn't seem to be a culture. Problem is there doesn't seem to be a culture that's been established. So anyway, back to the point is, so naturally made wines, I'll just find that last. So organic wines are wines that are certified organic by some kind of a
typically a government
organization,
agency,
right? And they have to follow very strict protocols for being organic,
both on the farm and in the winery,
right?
In terms of what they can use to treat and change and add to the wine, sulfates and all that, and all that.
I would say most wineries don't go through that because they not only might not agree with all what it takes to be certified. They also oftentimes have to pay to be certified.
Well, and this is the same situation we have with farms that are organic versus farms that use the term sustainably raised, right? Sustainably raised technically means the same thing as organic. It simply means we didn't jump through all the hoops that the government wanted us to jump through and spend the thousands of dollars on attorneys to be able to get the sticker on our thing that says.
But if you have a
certified
relationship
organic,
with your farmer and
you trust them anyway.
right, exactly.
Right.
So the same thing, really should go for wine. Then biodynamic is a much more intricate and complicated process that has to do with biodynamics, which was created by, correct me if I'm wrong, Rudolf Steiner.
Yes.
Yeah. In like 1920 something, and
I think it might have even been earlier than that.
earlier than that. Okay, so it sounds pretty hocus pocus to most people.
I love Tony knows that I'm sort of obsessed with biodynamics.
But in broad general strokes, I mean, just think about how the phases of the moon and different herbal soups and herbal teas should be used to govern how you farm your vineyards.
It's the idea of how people might have farmed several hundred years ago.
Right.
Think of the Druids or whatever might have farmed.
What do they have at
using
their access?
Moon
What tools do they
phases is
have?
for calendars and using natural sort of herbal teas and remedies for pest control and fungus control and that sort of thing. But biodynamics is also this idea that the entire farm is a living thing.
Yes.
From the people that are farming on it, the soil, the air, the sky. I mean, it's sort of very connected to the theory of terroir as well, right? Which is that everything sort of works and coalesces to build this flavor.
Exactly. So
Right.
there's a huge movement in wine.
Yes.
So many wineries produce biodynamically, and you can look at studies that suggest it's actually effective, because when people blind taste a biodynamic wine versus one that's not biodynamically made, more often than not, people will choose, they will prefer the biodynamic.
Right. And there are lots of other little pieces to this puzzle, but I don't want to talk too much about that because we're actually going to do another podcast all about biodynamics.
Oh, wow. Okay, great.
And wine. So I just wanted to touch on that. And then natural, which is both a definition for how the wine is treated in the winery as well as kind of define what happens in the vineyard.
So natural would just be using a minimal amount of, what do you need to make wine? You need grapes and yeast.
Right.
Okay, so you crush the grapes, and there's probably yeast naturally living on the skins of the grapes or in the cellar that will spontaneously start the fermentation, and then you press it and
as opposed
and you
to
let it age.
starting fermentation
with a
chemically.
catalog yeast, which most people do because it's very risky to not do that.
Right. There are lots of things that can go very wrong when you're
So-
hoping for nature
Right.
to make a good bottle of
Exactly.
wine.
So I'm not like saying that people that don't use natural yeast to make wine are bad people or they shouldn't be. Not to say that, but if we're talking about it, let's just talk about it. So that's what that means: is using native yeasts. And just minimal intervention. You can add acid, you can add tannin, you can add sugar, there's just so many things you could add to wine to make it taste the way you think the market wants your wine to taste.
And natural wine means you're not doing that.
Right. Natural wine just makes you're making a wine that's a representative of what these grapes and this land can produce.
And can we say, and Tony, I'm going to turn to you for this because I think I know what Tommy's opinion is, and Tommy, please feel free to follow up. But can we say that the general perception is that natural wines have more of a life and a sort of mercurial nature to them, and that they're not as formulaic as something that is more, I was calling it factory winemaking, but you were saying mass produced, right, Tony?
Sure.
Tommy?
Yeah.
So, Tony, what do you think about that? The change that natural wine has this sort of like life to it is the term I've heard used most often.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the opposite of that is the winemakers that are very manipulative and they're trying to create a wine to make money, to get big scores, and it's probably not being true.
You mean like Parker, right?
The Parkerization. They're not being as honest as they could or should be in both the vineyard and in the actual winemaking process.
Not in terms of what they're telling people they're doing, but in just honest in trying to let the wine have its own integrity.
Yeah, as he was saying, like actually speak to the true terroir, to what the vineyard actually has to offer, what the land has to offer. that's a pretty interesting thing, whether you're talking about vegetables or grapes or, animals, what they're really pulling from that little region they're in. That's pretty amazing thing to kind of see happen. So yeah, that's very important.
Yeah, and I just want to say it's extremely complicated. So
It is very complicated, and that's
and
why
I don't want to say that one way is better than another in terms of how just to make great wine by crushing the grapes and letting it go, you're probably going to make some pretty bad wine.
Yeah.
So you do have to kind of you've got to finesse it, and you've got to use techniques.
And trending right now is the natural wine, is the biodynamic wine, which makes sense because that's really what's trending in every other aspect of edibles right now. Both, potables, edibles. The idea is, trying to get back to sort of the ancient ways of doing things and letting things find their true flavor.
Right.
And so it doesn't surprise me that that's what's trending in wine. I'm not saying that there aren't good wines that are made that are mass produced, because certainly there are. Otherwise, people wouldn't be drinking them.
Yeah, no.
I mean, there are some good wines that are mass produced. Look at your face; you can't even do it.
I don't know.
I don't know if they're.
Well, I just mean
I'm trying.
I just mean what I meant to say is that there are traditional. Okay, so what I was talking what I interjected about is I just wanted to clarify that I'm not necessarily against traditional versus modern wines.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the traditional winemaking technique, which is to say that they make wines using neutral barrels or glass-lined cement.
Sure.
And then there's modern, which picks the grapes later so that they're riper and they have more sugar.
And their hand going through everything by hand, right?
Well, in modern and traditional,
Okay.
you could do the same. So I wanted to just say that I'm not I personally prefer probably more traditional leaning wines, but I don't want to say that that person that's drinking the modern wine doesn't know what they're talking about. What we are against is the factory wine.
I see what you're saying.
So mass produced on huge production levels are you making good wine? Probably not. I mean, how good could it be if how much oversight could there be in that wine if it's being mass produced? Probably not much. I mean, you're making, hundreds of thousands of cases of wine versus 10,000 cases or less. So there's wines that are made 10,000 cases or less, or even smaller production that are extremely modern, super extracted, really ripe, rich, heavy wines. Now, I'm not here to say that those wines aren't any good, but they're not necessarily natural or non-interventionist.
Right.
What we're saying is that stuff that's that's what I was saying. I wanted to clarify that
Yep.
stuff's not necessarily bad, but what I would agree with is the stuff that's mass produced is probably not that great. No.
Okay. Tony, do you have a differing opinion here at all?
Of mass production? No. I mean, I don't drink it, so.
Okay, so let's talk about the fact that if we're gonna, so now that we've defined some terms,
Yeah.
right, so people know what we're talking about, let's talk about. We already mentioned that it's hyper nuanced, that it's very challenging to read the labels of wine, and that these are two reasons that might be why it hasn't caught on the same way the craft beer movement has, which of course is relatively new, and so therefore going back and learning everything you need to know about craft beer, I argue, is a slightly less daunting task than trying to learn everything there is to know about wine.
Right.
And the craft cocktail movement and all of that stuff. Why is it that we have such a challenge ahead of us in terms of getting people to understand and appreciate small producer wines that are natural, wines that are biodynamic? What are is it really just that people want predictability? Is that people want a gallon of wine that costs the same as a gallon of gas? I mean, is that what the problem is? I mean, is it that the market isn't ready for new and exciting?
Well, yeah. I mean, firstly, cost is an issue. Wine is more expensive than beer. I think that's one issue, and then also it's not as
some wine
available.
Some wine is more expensive.
Well, it depends on the beer, right?
Beer.
Sure, right. It's all,
I just thought about like a $4 bottle of Yellowtail versus Eddie Topper.
We're generalizing throughout this whole thing here, but the other thing is that it's not as some are not as available. Maybe A lot of this stuff's really limited production. So people come into the restaurant all the time and they say, I love this. All right, where can I buy this? And I'm like, nowhere. The only place you can get it is here, which I always joke about saying, well, which is great for me because now you have to come back.
Right. but the thing is that if somebody's only making 8,000 cases of wine, and shelf space in every store we know is highly prized and highly valuable and pretty much dominated by people who are mass producing wine, it's nearly impossible for somebody who is only making 10,000 cases of something to get shelf space in any market with any kind of real foothold.
Which is the other thing is what you said is the predictability. People recognize things like Cabernet, Pinot Noir, Merlot, Pinot Grigio, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, and Riesling, which are a tiny, tiny fraction of the grape. I mean, in Italy alone, there's more than 2,000 to 3,000 grape varietals.
Right.
Indigenous, unique grape varietals. And I just mentioned 6.
Yeah.
Right? So retail stores, aren't super psyched to go and put these grape varietals that no one's ever heard of on their shelves because they're probably not going to move.
The risk is huge, right?
Right? So in a restaurant where there's someone like me or Tony there, it's a little bit easier because we can actually sell the wine.
And I think partially that is kind of the age-old marketing design for a small production winery. They count on because they're called on-premise sales, so they only sell to restaurants or their mailing lists. The general public doesn't have access to it. They probably don't even know about the mailing list, or if they do they want to commit themselves to a case or two every 6 months? But the other way that it happens too is once they're in our restaurants and we're talking about it and they get to try this and they do fall in love with that wine, they come back, they get it again, and then slowly this wine becomes a little bit more available and a little more available, and in some cases, and you can start seeing it in
what I think the path then is to not really get people so attached to one single wine is to just let them relax a little bit, open up their minds, and try some new things.
And do you think
you might not be able to get that wine try that wine again that you had at the restaurant, but maybe next time you'll be a little bit more willing to be adventurous.
Well, and that's where
or
it
even
really
a style.
is. I'm sorry, Tony.
Or even a style,
Well, and it's where it's really important that you actually have a relationship with somebody who you trust in that scenario, because I understand why people feel nervous about dropping $60 on a bottle of wine they haven't had before. If you don't like it, you're stuck with it, right? And that's a lot of money. At any time, in any place, $60 is a lot of money for a beverage to have with your meal. So certainly going to a place all the time where someone like yourselves is there and can guide people, and people should feel comfortable telling you how much money they want to spend when they're sitting at the table, right? It's awkward. It feels very awkward as the consumer to say to the wine guy, look, I'd really like a nice bottle of wine. I really like white. I like acid. I don't want to spend more than $45 and not feel like an asshole. That's really hard to do.
Well, it depends on who you are. I mean, I try to feel them out. And if I feel like I can talk about price, I'll just be very frank and blunt and say, what is your budget? If they're with someone, maybe they're not with people that they know very well.
Right.
So you wouldn't want to say that.
Right.
But the other thing is that in that case, then, as the professional, I think you really should be pointing out wines in different price points.
That's pretty much, that's your job.
Yeah. You point out a highlight. Here's a highlight in the $25 to $35 range. Here's a highlight in the $45 to $55. Here's a $65 to $75, and then here's a $400 bottle. It's awesome.
Because
$400 bottle better be awesome. That's all I'm going to say.
But everybody's had that bad experience, and those restaurants have started to get reputations for it as well. Yes. Going in there and saying, "Hey, I really like this style," and all of a sudden they're recommended, a $185 bottle, and it's pushed on them, that's where it really. Then all of a sudden people like us get a negative connotation. Then we're just a used car salesman.
And that's the problem is that, when the restaurant is really, there are just different kinds of restaurants, and there's a certain type of restaurant which exists in every town, and which there are usually a handful of, where it's more like a used car salesman at your table, even if the place has white linen and crushed velvet and beautiful food and whatever else. The guy at the table with the fat watch on is there pressure salesing the customer into buying something they're not maybe comfortable doing, but they don't. So it's a very challenging situation for a customer.
And as a customer, I mean, if I'm if like customers are listening to this and like saying, okay, so then what should I do? Like for me, I would just be blunt and be like, we're looking for something $50 or less.
Yeah.
Or we're looking for something.
Take control
we're looking
of
for
the
something
table.
in a $30 price range, a nice everyday table wine for the meal.
There you go.
What's wrong with that? What's wrong with a good everyday table wine? You mean if you're going to drink a bottle of wine every day, are you going to drink a bottle of wine that retails for $30 a bottle? Probably not. I mean,
Right.
I'm
Tapo. That's why Tapo's popular. I mean,
Yeah,
$15
well, sure,
bottles.
$15 bottles of wine, right?
But it speaks to
But-
the public when they're frequently drinking. I mean,
If
to
you
his
drink a
point
bottle
exactly.
of wine every single day, you're not spending $100 every single day, right?
Now, but there is something important to mention is that there is a limit to how cheap a bottle of wine can get.
Yes. Again, my gallon of gas,
exactly.
gallon of wine analogy. I will never buy a wine at the store that's less than $10. I'll tell you what, there's no way. If I
would
can buy
say,
a latte
yeah.
for the same price as a bottle of wine, which when you think about the process of what it took to put that bottle of wine on the shelf, just the shipping alone, just the cardboard, just the glass, like it's horrifying.
Let's just talk about retail pricing right now. So, just to give you an idea, is that it's hard to find a really unique bottle of wine that retails between $10 and $15. But once you go between 15 and 20, the jump in quality, or even 15 and 25, the jump in quality is really huge.
I agree.
You're gonna get a much better wine, but that doesn't. Okay, but that's still to say that But I'm looking for an everyday bottle of wine that I can buy for $10 a bottle. They're out there. Don't get me wrong.
Well, if you buy a whole case, you're better off too, right?
Sure.
Because you get a better price.
So they're out there, but there's much fewer, and I think there's a limit. Like when you're going under, even like $12, $13, when you're going under, then you're starting to get into more, mass-produced wines. But if you're just looking for something that mindless to drink, great. But we're talking about wines that you just want to sit down and actually Tony talked to me about this. Is that it's funny. He came in one night and he said, well, they've done, I don't know if they've done studies or how he came up with this information, but it makes a lot of sense to me. It's that when you're really stressed out and you're really just kind of like, anxious or you're really wound up, there's a lot of acid in your body. Your pH level is high. So wine usually doesn't taste good because wine has really high pH. Mm-hmm. So usually that's why I usually go for the booze. Which makes total sense to me because I enjoy wine most when I'm at my most relaxed. And I'm really relaxed, and you want to just sit with the wine. There's nothing like sitting with a naturally made wine that's small production. You open the bottle, you sit with it, and watch it change for the next hour or hour and a half if it takes you that long to drink a bottle of wine. And that is what gets wine people
excited.
That's what gets them. That's what makes people into wine people. Right. Is when they start doing that and they're like, holy, this wine tastes nothing like it did when I first opened. That's what gets them.
That's the best part.
Yeah.
And I would like to suggest, and if you guys have other suggestions, please let me know. But if people are interested in having some guidance in a retail environment, for me, like $18 to $22 is my really comfortable sweet spot. Like I have no problem if a wine isn't great and it's that price, but if it's good, it's phenomenal, right? I think Paradise Wines. Have you been there yet? It's on the west side,
right on Rhode Island.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And I also think that City Wine Merchant does a really amazing job with their wines. Is there anywhere else that you guys would suggest people go if they're not super wine nerds but would like to maybe venture in some new directions outside of their Yellowtail?
Well, you could always go to Bob Layton at Brighton Liquors,
sure,
which is an experience in itself.
It certainly is.
So, I mean,
he's been providing wine to the most elite and everyday wine people of Western New York for a long time.
Yeah, and he's a great person, and it is I won't say much more than
that's good enough.
It's fun. You should go, and I'd love to hear what you come up with. You're not going to see what you buy. He's just going to pick something out for you.
Yeah.
It's part of the experience.
Tony, is there anywhere else that you like to buy wine in the area?
Yeah, from my restaurant? No. Honestly, Gates does a pretty solid job, especially in that price point specific that you're talking. I mean, they've got some of the more high-end stuff and whatever. I don't think I've ever actually bought a really expensive bottle from them. But in that, like, 18 to 25... more often than not, I've been pretty happy with it. Or I've recognized things that I've, tasted before. I'm like, all right, that was really solid.
They also have a really good selection of local wines, which is a whole nother conversation. Good and bad local wines. They have a very broad selection, which is hard to find in a wine shop that small.
Yeah. But I mean, that's pretty cool because that's 3 wine shops all right downtown.
Yes.
All pretty much in a really, really good radius of central downtown. So no matter where you are, you've got something pretty cool to go to.
So I could seriously sit here and talk to you guys for another 2 hours. Not that you would necessarily want to do that, but I'd like to just briefly talk about sort of what we've talked about, things that individual people can do if they'd like to learn more about wine, and things that restaurants could potentially do if they would like to be better with their customers about wine. But my biggest concern, and Tony and I have talked about this, and Tommy, we probably have too, is that most of the wine lists in town right now are distributor driven. They're wine lists that are determined by what the distributor wants to sell to the restaurant. They're coming in to a new restaurant where maybe there isn't somebody who really knows a lot about wine, and suggesting that they can, make them good profits, sell them wines people will like, and even, print their menus or whatever or other things for them. Yeah. And that what this results in sometimes, if your distributor is brilliant, is great. And sometimes if your distributor is just trying to unload stuff that they either don't want or can make the most money on, that's what your wine list is made out of. And that's where I think we see a lot of Kendall Jackson and these sorts of things on people's wine lists. I mean, it worries me because I feel like if you're a nice restaurant, even if you're only a mediocre restaurant, you probably should be offering people something better. We're now seeing these people have craft tap handles in their restaurants and wanting to make real cocktails. So why are we still serving people, Columbia Crest or whatever wines? And I'm just wondering I feel like some of it is because owners and chefs maybe don't know as much about wine as they want people to believe that they do, or that they think they should know. And I'm not sure if that person is comfortable asking the questions they need to ask to get the wine list they really want.
Well, I mean,
both of you are like, Christa, what are you talking about?
No. That's great. No, it's a
PC question. It's a problem.
No. It's nothing I'm uncomfortable talking about.
Okay, go.
At all. The issue is, it's what are the resources and are the people out there for them to hire to that know about wine to set up their wine list for them. If you open a restaurant, you don't know about wine, then who do you ask and where do you go? I don't necessarily know the answer to that. I mean, if someone were to call me up and ask me questions about wine,
are you soliciting yourself?
No, yeah, I guess that's what's happening right now. Of course, I would be available to myself, but I mean, realistically, you're busy. You're opening a restaurant. You're very, very busy. So I think the bigger issue is the labor pool for restaurant people and how educated they are about wine. And like we said in the beginning, it's a culture that has to be created. Before the show, we were talking about there's a culture that exists among collectors that are empty nesters or have a lot of money that are willing to collect really expensive wine, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a popular movement to appreciate small production wine that retails from $12 to $20 a bottle.
Right.
That's what we're talking about.
So hopefully the same population that appreciates craft cocktails and craft beer. So I would think
there needs to be a professional group like there are for the craft beer and cocktail culture that work at places like Bourbon and Butter and work at Buffalo Proper and Bira and Blue Monk and Navy V and you name it, all of those places. There needs to be people that are educated in the same way that those professionals are educated, working in the restaurants that are proud of their wine lists. And pretty much every restaurant should be proud of its wine lists.
Right, because your wine list, I mean, I don't know, it doesn't make any sense to me why you would be proud of your beer list or proud of your whiskey selection and then be phoning it in on the wine list. And I'll tell you what, it is really challenging as a person who likes to drink wine by the glass at bars just as often as I like to have a craft cocktail, there are not a lot of places in town where I like what's on the wine list.
Or if they
and
even
I'm not
have
that picky.
or even if they have the appropriate stemware to drink out of.
Oh,
the,
stop picking on me.
No, but I completely agree too, because I mean, there's 3 serious bars / restaurants that recently opened in the past about 8 months. These 3 that I'm speaking about are very much focused on cocktails and beer.
Yes.
And the one really cool thing that all of their owners did said, hey, you have to go past Bar Smarts, or the beer equivalent to that. And, that was, their bartenders had to do it. They had to know this stuff. And by that is a program that, imparts a ton of knowledge about liquor and spirits in general. And I can't remember the last time a restaurant opened that made their staff or even encouraged their staff to, hey, go take a somm test.
Right.
Or just sign up for the introductory. We'll pay for it. Or, I mean, that's just not out there. So there is not as much focus on within restaurants for that. The other way I see it is, and I've been fortunate enough to be a part of several restaurant openings, quite a few actually, and every single time is the exact same thing. You do everything. The restaurant always gets a little bit behind. Whatever, you're still going to open. You're still going to be great. The one thing that's left out is they forget about the wine.
Yep.
They don't have enough money to buy what they were going to buy.
Right.
Or it just becomes a second thought and they're like, we got to get open and,
we'll buy wine
do
6
the
months
best you
from now.
can. Do the
Pick out
best you
10
can.
bottles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they themselves are the first to say, this is not the most important thing in our restaurant. And it should be, I'm not saying it's got to be the most important, but it's got to be an
equivalent. It's a major
equivalent
profit center. And I don't understand. I just don't understand what it is. I mean, I don't think it's just Western New York, but it's certainly pervasive here. There's just a lack of respect for wine in general, I think, unfortunately, in the restaurant industry. I hate saying that because it makes me sad, because it shouldn't be that way. It's like an important, crucial part of food and beverage being your lifestyle, is having some appreciation for all aspects of it. And I just feel like there's no respect for it. And I think that we pass that on to our buyers and our consumers. People complain that Western New Yorkers don't like to drink great wine outside of a handful of very wealthy collectors and aficionados. And I think the truth is that we really have not, as a community, as an industry, have not made the investment to see the consumer's appreciation and understanding of it.
I would agree with that.
I think we're as responsible for that as anyone else is.
Yeah,
is what I'm saying.
I would take responsibility for that for sure. I would say we don't have those early adopters like we do in cocktails and beer.
Because it's not cool.
Absolutely.
Because it's not cool. It's not cool.
You have those the beer girls that go around, the giant group
beer goddesses.
The beer goddesses.
Yeah, Julia Burke founded them.
Yeah, so that happens there's not a group. You have the Red Hat Society, and those women are all like 70 years old.
Yeah.
Well, also I'm just saying that like I'm not necessarily like gonna like kill myself to convert that Pinot Grigio drinker into something else. But what I am, this conversation is making me think about is that, all right, well, where's the people that never drank cocktails before? There's the people that never drank cocktails before.
That's what I'm saying.
And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, I love cocktails and this and that.
Serious.
And they like got really into it and they started promoting it. So where's the people that never drank wine before and then they started to like, oh man, wow, this cava is amazing, or this Vino Verde,
that's what I'm
or
saying,
this
Tommy,
like
is
amphora aged orange wine is super cool.
I don't think we can convert people who are already dialed into Budweiser and Yellowtail.
Right.
But there's a huge segment of the Western New York population that is currently right now supporting the 30 some odd restaurants that have opened in the last 2 years, and the next 30 that are opening that are the early adopters. They are the ones who care about local or organic. They are the ones who care about craft cocktails and craft beer. And I just am not understanding why they don't give a fuck about wine.
So I think that one of the issues that you said is the distributor-driven wine list.
Yes.
So that has to. We start breaking that. There's a lot that we have we have the benefit of being in Buffalo, which is the same state that New York City is in.
Sure.
So we can buy whatever they can get in New York City.
You guys can get here.
But we don't have as much sales presence as New York City does. So if you're a wine buyer, you might have to do some research to get some cool wines that aren't represented by a salesperson here, but we got to start making it and all the salespeople out there are going to like hate me for saying this, but we got to make it less about the representative and more about the winemaker.
Right.
And not that relationship with your rep is not it's not that that's not important, but if we are going to get to small production, having a relationship with a winery, like, and just buying it vintage after vintage because you know they make good wine in a great vintage
well, and this
or a
is
good.
What you're doing with Leonard Oaks Estate Winery and their Riesling, right?
Exactly. Having a relationship like that with a winery that makes wine the way you wanted to make it, that's something special, which is what you should start to try and seek out.
Tony?
Yeah, I think you're seeing there's several of our restaurants around town, that are really making a list focused on stuff that's more interesting and, specified. And then there's other restaurants that are in the middle and, you're not going to say they're distributor driven. So they've got a couple interesting things on there, but they still have Mondavi. And to the general public, as we said in the beginning, sometimes wine can be very intimidating, a little scary. Or even it's just when you're with the group, it's just easier to say, give me a bottle of Mondavi, because it's always...
Everybody will drink it.
Decent every time, It's rare that you're going to get it and you're like,
it's decent the same way
crap.
Budweiser is.
Hey, man, they make tons of money, but it's that issue of... the ease of it, honestly. So not that we're trying to make it difficult for people, but lessening the option of just saying, give me the KJ,
Right,
like if
not
that's not an option,
available.
then maybe something that's similar to it,
So I think there's a lot of places.
Scratch that. No, let's reverse. Not similar to Kendall Jackson ever. So just to be clear.
I think there's a lot of ways this conversation could continue, and I think it's something we should continue to talk about because I think there's a lot of work to be done in this arena. Because I have 25 things on my list we never even talked about today, and I'd like to think that those of you who are listening who are intimately involved in the restaurant scene and who know Tony and Tommy will please just strike up a conversation and talk about wine. You guys are so giving with information and knowledge and in a way that is totally unintimidating. It is so easy to learn things from you guys when you have the time. And so I hope that people, chefs, restaurant owners, servers who know you guys and are curious and interested about this will have conversations with you because I don't know how often that really happens.
No,
outside of your own restaurant.
I don't think it really does very much, but
right, that's shocking
awesome.
To me.
Yeah.
Shocking. But to wind up, we're just going to go on a little note here. In the last 2 years, I would say that rosé and maybe Chocolina have become like really popular wines that we've seen covered in New York Times. Like, this is a summertime wine that you want to drink, and this is what's hip, and this is what's cool.
I drink Behringer all the time.
So is there a particular varietal or style of wine that is coming into trend that you guys are both really excited about or that you're happy to see getting some attention?
Maybe kind of slightly off the radar, maybe might be coming to trend is, for me, what I'm talking about is really, really light red wine,
Light-bodied, you mean?
Light body. Well, I'm noticing people, which is exciting for me at the restaurant, is our core clientele is very established and, into what they are into. But I notice people are starting to drink lighter and lighter wines, say medium-bodied wines, as opposed to super full wines, which goes better with our food. But what I've noticed is that, really good Beaujolais can be, short skin contact, just, light and soft, but just so intensely flavored.
Yeah, I love that's one of my
so
favorites.
intensely flavored and spice and floral and just all different kinds of flavors. I had a great bottle of wine in New York that was just it looked rosé, but it was a red wine.
Nice.
In that it was just so pale, but just so flavorful, so much flavor, and so easy to drink. I'd love to see more of those. They're kind of hard to find.
Well, but if they're popular, if they're happening, by next summer we'll probably have more of them, don't you think?
Yeah.
It usually takes about a year for us to get stuff to become sort of more. appreciated.
I would hope so. So to see more of that would be pretty cool.
How many of those do you have on the menu right now? Would you say?
I would say I have one bottle that's hard to get, and I have an a SP68 Rosso, which is a Sicilian blend of Nero d'Avola and Frappato. Really just light perfumed and super flavorful. It's hard to sell light-bodied wines because a lot of people identify them. They say they're thin or they're
right.
watery.
They feel like it's watery because they're used to eating drinking like a fat, big, fruity red, right?
Light in body and full in flavor.
Ah, very smart.
That's the
Tommy Lombardo way.
yeah. That's the. Not that there's anything wrong with full-bodied wines.
No,
don't get me wrong, but if you're gonna have a couple bottles of wine.
Well, yeah, and a full-bodied wine in the summer isn't always so pleasant and doesn't often go with the food,
right? Yeah.
For sure. Tony, anything you're really excited about?
Absolutely agree with that point about the wine-driven side of it too. We did a dinner just a few weeks ago with Chef Victor from Jaguar at the Bistro, and between him and Mike, none of their food really paired with heavy reds.
Right.
I mean, I used a Pinot Noir on one course, and everything else was either white or it was sherry. And those were exactly what the food needed. Never once did it need a Cabernet,
Right.
I love Cab, but it just didn't call for it. So I didn't feel like I was gypping our guests or customers by not giving them, exactly what they expected when they got, Doc. It was something, a little bit different. So, other things that I sound like a broken record, but I love sherry. So I just keep coming back to it, and it's just, to the point where I can drink glasses of it, no problem.
You have the sherry book, I assume.
By far the best value.
The sherry book that just came out is awesome. It's awesome.
It's the best value, and there's bang for your buck. You're never going to get a better value. The amount of energy and time that someone puts into making sherry, you translate into wine. It's because
you can drink an 18-year-old sherry for $20.
No, I know. It's incredible. I think one of the suggestions I would make, and I actually did this, is I went through the sherry book and I picked out 10 different bottles of sherry, and I went and bought all of them and did them all at once, tasted them all at once. It was a really awesome, good learning experience. And it wasn't expensive, and if you got a bunch of friends together and did that, how much fun is that?
And you can buy many of them in 375s, half bottles.
Right.
Which, they don't, unless you're talking about Fino, they don't really go bad. So you have an extended period of time to try these and taste them with people. And they're just amazing with food. We did something really fun. We just did a simple pairing, which is old school traditional, just Fino and oysters. But so many people have never tried it. And this group specifically, after they were done, and I just gave them a little tiny 1 ounce sample. They're like, let's do it again. And they reordered another round of oysters.
Well, you and Mike did oysters with pink peppercorns and a sherry for me at a dinner that I had last winter at the restaurant. It was phenomenal pairing.
The only thing I would say is I do feel like people, obviously in every genre that we've been talking about, they are becoming more educated. So that's can be nothing more than a positive when we're talking about wine as well. You're seeing people not coming in as often asking for white Zin or wanting the sweetest Riesling. We're not talking about good German Riesling. We're talking about just sweet over
sugar, right?
Yeah, sugar water, basically. That American palates seem to be drying out a little bit more so.
Well, and the hop movement with the IPAs and everything in the craft beer, I think, is helping with that.
Yeah. The American palate is definitely changing and becoming more educated and a little bit more adventurous. And I think that's what's going to be the part of the driving part of it in the next few years as well. So,
and I just want to say that talking about people becoming more educated, I feel like if you're not educated is intimidating and
sure.
Well, damn, I'm not educated. It doesn't matter if you're educated or not if you're willing to just ask for help,
ask questions.
Yeah,
and fully own when you don't know something. It's okay,
right?
I tell people when I don't know something all the time. It's the best way to learn.
And I often say, I don't know the answer to that. And it's like we all have the entire encyclopedia of the world in our pockets.
It's true.
It's like I can tell you how many times someone asked me a question about a wine, and I just step aside and go to the coat room and Google.
How many?
That iPhone is amazing.
Answer.
The scary thing is when you're ordering a craft cocktail that's like a Manhattan or an old fashioned, and somebody pulls out their phone to do that, then it's time to go.
Okay,
right?
Yeah, sure. But it'll be what some obscure,
But yes, people should ask
what
questions.
What is this aged in? Is aged in new oak, neutral oak, acacia wood? I'm like, I'm not so sure, but maybe I can find out.
Anyway, well, I mean, I really do feel, I hope that you guys would consider maybe doing a couple more podcasts with me this year, because I think that this would be a great way to sort of set the tone for people being more comfortable talking about what they do and don't know and asking questions about wine among the restaurant community, since so many of our listeners are people who work in the industry. So thank you so much for being here with me today, you guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Grain of Salt. To keep up to date on future episodes, follow us on SoundCloud, Facebook, and Trending Buffalo. Again, thank you to Step Out Buffalo for sponsoring this episode. Check out stepoutbuffalo.com for what to see, things to do, and food to try in Western New York. Find info on festivals, beer events, concerts, tours, and everything else happening in Buffalo.